We're learning Sicha Beis, Chelek Yutes, Parshas Eikev, on page 94. So Sicha and Rashi in this week's Parsha, a very geschmacke Sicha. In Posik, Kol ha-mitzvah sha'anochi mitzavcha hayom, tishmerun la'asais v'geimer, stellt sich Rashi auf die Werte Kol ha-mitzvah, und is mefarish. So Rashi explains these two words, Kol ha-mitzvah. Kipshutoi. The first pshat is as a simple meaning, Kol ha-mitzvah, all mitzvahs you should fulfill, and so on. Medrash Haggadah, in the Medrash it says, in mischalta b'mitzvah gemoiraisa. If you began doing a mitzvah, so complete it. The chuluk, it'll come on Sif Beis, the Rebbe will bring the rest of Rashi and focus on that later in Sif Beis. But first, was is schwer in the Mershten Pirish kipshutai? What is not understood? What's difficult with the simple pshat of the Pasik? Was zu lieb dem, darf Rashi bringen a zweiten Pirish? And therefore Rashi has to bring a second pshat. Und dazu noch vom Medrash Haggadah. And not just a second pshat that's simple in the meaning of the Pasik, but a pshat only from the Medrash. Then Mefarshim Masber, so Mefarshim explain the question Rashi is addressing here. As in Pasik is schwer der Loshen, Kol ha-mitzvah. This expression of Kol ha-mitzvah is difficult to translate. Was mitzvah is a Loshen Yachid. Mitzvah is a singular term. Ein mitzvah, one mitzvah. Und the mashmos from Kol is alle mitzvahs. Kol means all of the mitzvahs. So it should use a plural term. Kol ha-mitzvahs, not Kol ha-mitzvah. That's the question here. So darf man sagen. So what would you answer to explain why it says in a singular term mitzvah? As the Taichin Kol ha-mitzvah da, that the meaning of Kol ha-mitzvah here is nit alle mitzvahs. It doesn't mean all of the mitzvahs. Nor jede mitzvah. What it means is, the Eibush is saying you should fulfill each and every mitzvah. So Kol is each and every. So it's the singular term is appropriate. But now what's the question? Es bleibt aber nicht verstandig. But if so, the question is, the Fizet gedarft stehen, Kol mitzvah. Every mitzvah. Onahei. When you say every, you don't say every the mitzvah. Every mitzvah should be fulfilled. Nit Kol ha-mitzvah. If you're saying all the mitzvahs, so then you say all of the mitzvahs. That's like in English, so too over here, Kol ha-mitzvahs. But if it's every mitzvah, so then it's Kol mitzvah. So therefore that's the problem here, that's the question that Rashi is coming to address. The Rebbe sagt Rashi, so therefore Rashi says first, kipshutai, that we should teach the pasuk literally simply. And then, Medrash Haggadah v'chulu, then Rashi brings the Medrash, which means, nit guckendig auf die Schwierigkeiten ersten Pirish, not looking at the fact that the first Pirish is not smooth, it's not perfect. Kipshutai, the simple pshat, is doch das der Pirish rishon ve'ikri im pshutai shom mikri. Nevertheless, this is the first and main pshat, because in the simple meaning of the pasuk, the Eibush is speaking about all of the mitzvahs. Aber kedei zu verämpfern die Shaila now. However, in order to answer this question, why does it say kol and then ha-mitzvah singular with the hey there? Bringt Rashi a zweiten Pirish from Medrash Haggadah. So Rashi brings a second pshat from the Medrash, that im mischalta b'mitzvah gemoiraisa. If you began with a mitzvah, you should complete it. Was leut ein Pirish, red take the pasuk wegen ein mitzvah. So that answers the question, because we're speaking about only one mitzvah. Und der Loshen Kol ha-mitzvah meant, what does Kol here mean? As medavton, the ganze mitzvah. You should do all of the mitzvah. It's a completely different pshat in Kol. So we have three ways of interpreting the word Kol. Either Kol means all of the mitzvahs, or Kol means each mitzvah, or Kol means the whole mitzvah. You should do the mitzvah in its entirety. Und nicht a mikzas von a mitzvah, not just a part of a mitzvah. That's the pshat that the Mefarshim here say to explain what Rashi is addressing and how it answers the question in the second Pirish. Kadaikis aber, however, if you are medayik, you'll see that me kennet sagen, as Rashi is eisen zu bewahren otikasha. That Rashi is here to address this question. Weil derselbe Loshen, Kol ha-mitzvah, this very same expression of Kol ha-mitzvah, steht schon früher in Chumash, is already brought, it's written for earlier in the Torah, in the Parsha, in Vaschanon, so it's there already. Und Rashi stellt sich dort on top of them. And Rashi does not stop to address this question that the words Kol ha-mitzvah doesn't fit. Muss man sagen, as das is by Rashi kein Kash in it. So we have to say that Rashi doesn't address it because it's not really a question. Weil euch Kol ha-mitzvah ken lit Rashi meinen alle mitzvahs. Kol ha-mitzvah could mean all of the mitzvahs, even though it should say in a plural term, but it could mean all the mitzvahs. The Rabbi brings here in Order 10, what it says in the Ra'am, that because all mitzvahs are one category, it's all the same min, so the Torah uses a singular term, even though it says kol, and it means all of the mitzvahs. So that's not a question that Rashi addresses, and the Raya is, Rashi didn't address it earlier in Parshas Vaschana. If so, our question comes back, welche Schwierigkeit ist da in kol mitzvah, was steht in unser Parsha? What is the specific question in these two words of kol mitzvah that's written here in this week's Parsha? Was dafke da stellt sich Rashi auf dem, and then only here Rashi stops to address this, und sagt kepshutai, and first he tells you that there's a simple pshat, und bringt noch euch a pirish from Medrash Agada, and then he brings also a pshat from the Medrash. So there's something else going on over here in this Rashi. Now the Rebbe brings the continuation of the Rashi. In the Pirish from Medrash Agada, was Rashi bringt, in the Pshat from the Medrash that Rashi quotes Ubariches, and Rashi brings it with the whole length, with all the details that it says. Im ischalta b'mitzvah, if you began a mitzvah, Gemay Reisa, complete it. She'ena nikras ha-mitzvah, when you call the mitzvah on the name of somebody, it's not called Ella al Shema Gaimra, only on the one that completed the mitzvah. There are different people that add a connection in this mitzvah, the one that began, one that completed. We attribute to the mitzvah to the one that completed it. Shenemar, and the raya from this is what it says, Ves atzmus Yosef asher helu b'nei Yisrael mitzrayim, the bones of Yosef that the Yidden brought out of Mitzrayim, kovru b'Shechem, they buried him in Shechem. So the question is, it was only Moshe that took care of taking Yosef out of Mitzrayim, not the Yidden. Elo, so why does it say that the Yidden took him out of Mitzrayim? Moshe did not manage to complete this mitzvah to bury Yosef in Shechem. The Gamrua Yisrael and the Yidden completed it. So therefore, Nekras al Shema, the mitzvah of taking Yosef out of Mitzrayim and burying him in Shechem is all attributed to the Yidden. That's the Rashi. So Rashi brings the Medrash with all the pratim. Darf man verstehen, kame de yukim and loshen Rashi. So there are questions here on this section and this part of the Rashi and the language Rashi uses, umehem, and from the questions are as follows. Aleph, number 1. L'chayre is the aschala von dem Pirish im ischalta b'mitzvah gemeiraisa. The point Rashi says right in the beginning. If you began a mitzvah, see it to its completion, maspik zum masbe sein dem loshen kol mitzvah. That suffices to explain the pshat of the words kol mitzvah, that here kol mitzvah means the whole mitzvah. Do it in its entirety. Was ist dann the hemshech she'ein nekras mitzvah ela al shema gaimra, the whole continuation where Rashi speaks about why one should see the mitzvah to its completion, the maila in this, and the example from Yosef, the raya from Yosef. None of that is relevant l'chayre for what Rashi is here to do, which is only pshutei shel mikra, to explain the proper translation of kol, the whole mitzvah. Beis, or befrat noch, specifically the raya thereof von Moshe shenem vasatzmus Yosef v'chulu. The whole raya that Rashi brings up from Moshe by the bones of Yosef, how does that add to the kol mitzvah that we're speaking about in the context of this parsha? Gimel, oib Rashi will schon bringen a raya. Was unterstreicht the choyme von nit goyme seiner mitzvah. So seemingly the point over here is Rashi wants to bring you a proof to stress the severity of the subject, how important it is to actually complete a mitzvah. Wollt ich mehr Mastung gewinnen zu bringen, die Reihe von welche Chazal and Gemara und Medrash lernen up, as a maskal b'mitzvah ve'ene goymre. Rashi should bring the source of what it says in the Gemara, where the Gemara learns out this concept that one that begins a mitzvah has to complete it. And over there, it's regarding Yehuda, that he began the mitzvah, he began saving Yosef, that is, and he didn't complete it, and because of this, he was taken down from his level, from his greatness, that later he buried his wife and children from Yehuda. So over there you see, in a much more powerful way, how important it is to see a mitzvah to its completion. So why, if Rashi is looking to bring the chaymer of this inyan, does he bring dafke from Yosef? It's actually from a much later generation, by Moshe and the Yidden carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim, and not from Yehuda earlier, and when you see it in a much more powerful way. Dalid, what's the lashon? Elo lefi shele hispek legaimra. That the reason why Moshe didn't complete the mitzvah is because he didn't manage to do it. Why is Rashi bringing this? Rashi will doch beker arais bringen as nekras al shem gaimra, that the one that completes it the mitzvah is attributed to him. That's the main point of this Rashi. Is mein Afgeminne for was Moshe hat die mitzvah nicht geime gewinnt. The reason of what exactly happened, why Moshe didn't complete it. Was it his own fault? Was it not his own fault? He didn't manage. It wasn't his fault. This detail, doesn't matter over here. The only thing we're trying to explain is the bottom line, the one that completes the mitzvah, we attribute the mitzvah to him. Why the one that began, in this case Moshe, couldn't complete it is irrelevant here. So since Rashi does add these words that Moshe didn't manage to complete, he couldn't, is mashma as das negeh der Eufen was der nit geimras gewend. That over here it is relevant for the context of this Rashi why the one that began couldn't complete the mitzvah. That it was ba'oines, lo hispik. Lo hispik means that it was an oines. It says nit gewend totally in him. It wasn't dependent. It wasn't a choice of Moshe Rabbeinu that the Eibusha did not allow him to enter into Eretz Yisrael, so he couldn't bring Yosef to his kvura and Shechem. So how is that detail relevant over here in this pasuk of Kol HaMitzvah? So the point of the explanation here is as follows. Wird werden verstandig behektim hashaila, with first addressing another question of why Rashi does not give us actually another way of explaining Kol HaMitzvah, which is also very simple in the pshat of the pasuk, instead of going to a medrash. Was lernt nicht Rashi dem Kol HaMitzvah wie andere Mefarshim lernen, als das bezieht sich zu dem, was es redt sich in die Psukim erst fardem. That Kol HaMitzvah is a continuation to what it speaks about in the Psukim right before this. Psile lekayem tisra from be'esh, leisachmoy v'leisavi v'sayevel b'secha, the Issa von Avodah Zarah. Right before this, it speaks about the Issa of Avodah Zarah and various details of the Issa of Avodah Zarah. And on that, the Torah is saying, Kol HaMitzvah, shanechi mitzav chayayim, that you should keep this mitzvah of the Issa of Avodah Zarah. Und der Fahr, weil es redt sich wegen ein Mitzvah, because it's speaking about one mitzvah, sagt der Torah, ha mitzvah lashon yachid, that refers to this mitzvah of Avodah Zarah. Why does it say kol ha-mitzvah? Und leidach wird auf dem gesagt kol, und es wird euch angerufen mitzvah stam. The Torah says the term kol, and it says the terminology mitzvah plain. It doesn't give any details of which mitzvah it speaks about. The Rashi hat schon mefarish gewesen bepirushe frie, and Rashi said this once earlier regarding Avodah Zarah. Shkula Avodah Salilim keneged kol ha-mitzvahs kulam. Avodah Zarah is equal to all mitzvahs. V'anizaba k'sheimeres kulam. One that's careful with this is like he's keeping all mitzvahs. So therefore it says kol, that this is like you're fulfilling all mitzvahs. Und lefiza is euch glattig der Loshen kol ha-mitzvah. It also explains why there's a hey there, the mitzvah, with a hey yediyah, the known mitzvah. The mitzvah wegen welches redt sich erst frie, because it refers to this mitzvah that we are just discussing, this mitzvah, the mitzvah that we just spoke about. So this would explain all the details of this expression of kol ha-mitzvah. The term kol, it's shakul keneged all the mitzvah, why it says mitzvah stam, and why it says ha-mitzvah. L'chayra, perfect pshat. So why doesn't Rashi say this? So the explanation here is as follows. And here the Rebbe takes us in to the context of the parsha. Let's look at what the Torah is speaking about here. In friedige Pesukim, sagt Moshe on the Yidden. Moshe tells the Yidden, as they will einnehmen Eretz Yisrael, they're going to come and they're going to conquer Eretz Yisrael. V'nosan malchem biyadecha, the Eibusher will give over the kings of the land into your hands. Und is mazer, as psile lekeim tisra from goymer, you should burn their Avodah Zarah, v'leitovi teyeva, don't bring their tayeva, their disgusting things into your house. Das heißt, so what's the context of the parsha? What are we speaking about? Wie mir darf sein abgehit nachdem, wie mir wird rein und kaufe sein Eretz Yisrael. That after you can come and conquer Eretz Yisrael, and there there'll be the Avodah Zarah of the Goyim that were there. So there you have to be careful with all this Avodah Zarah. That's what it speaks about before when it talks about Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah specifically in Eretz Yisrael after they come to conquer the land. The Meles, and so it's understood, is nit mistaver. It's not, doesn't make sense to say as kol ha-mitzvah meant dem friedigem tzivui from sile lekeim tisser from v'leisavi teyeva, that here in this pasuk when it says kol ha-mitzvah, it's talking about that Avodah Zarah that I spoke about earlier. Why? Varim in dem pasuk kol ha-mitzvah geimer is a mamshech. What is Moshe Rabbeinu saying to the Yidden? That the Yidden should fulfill all the mitzvahs. Kol ha-mitzvahs asher nechi mitzav chayim tishmurun la'asais. And what does it say after that? Laman tichyon uvasem v'yirishtem esaretz. that when you'll fulfill the mitzvahs, so then you'll be zeichet to come in Eretz Yisrael, to yarshen the land. As durch Tishmur Lasses, kol ha-mitzvah wird mit dem Leben zu später ankommen in yarshen Eretz Yisrael. You'll merit to come and live to go enter into Eretz Yisrael. Beis has the Friede Gitzivuyim, whereas before, in the Psukim before, where it speaks about Avodah Zarah, but ziehen sich zum Zman, was kommen nach dem Bossen v'rishtem Esaretz. What Yidden should be careful with after they had entered into Eretz Yisrael. So these two Psukim are not really related to each other. Before it talks about after, and now it's talking about what Yidden should be doing to be Zeiche to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So it's not a continuation. So we can't say that Kol Ha-Mitzvah refers to that mitzvah of Avodah Zarah that the Pasuk spoke about before. Chotsch as bedeichik kemen sagen, you could with difficulty say, as the mit werd gemeint the issa von Avodah Zarah bechlal, und lav dafke speter. That because it spoke about Avodah Zarah before, so even though there the context of the psukim is to be careful with Avodah Zarah after you enter the land, but nevertheless the point is it speaks about Avodah Zarah. So the parsha here is speaking about before, what Yidden should do to be zeiche to enter into the land, but it's a continuation speaking about Avodah Zarah, even though in a completely different context. But that's a deichik, because b'poil we can see that these psukim are not a continuation. Before Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the Yidden what they should be careful with after, and now he starts speaking to them what they should do to be zeiche to enter. So it's pashtus, it's a different inyan. So now that we see more the context of the parsha, the point there is we're speaking about the time period of the Yidden coming, getting ready to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the Yidden, you'll fulfill mitzvahs, you'll be zeiche to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So now we'll understand what was really bothering Rashi, as the Rebbe said before in the beginning, that what's bothering Rashi with the term kol ha-mitzvah. Apparently these two words is not what's bothering Rashi, like it didn't in Parshas Vaschana. But now that we see the context of the Parsha, we'll be able to understand. Al pi zeh wird man verstehen, was Rashi stellt sich auf den Pasuk und ist mefarish kepshutai. Why Rashi has to stop and tell you that kol ha-mitzvah should be translated in its simple meaning. And the point is as follows. So let's take even a more broader look at the time period of when this is being said. Moshe Rabbeinu hat angeheben sagen mishne teire ba'ashti yasa chaydish be'echad lachaydish. Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to the Yidden, and he begins on the Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the 11th month, and the first day of the month. Azoi, as Parshas Eikev, is durch ihm gesagt geworden, noch oder Rosh Chodesh Shvat. So this was said either sometime after Rosh Chodesh Shvat, between Rosh Chodesh Shvat and when Moshe Rabbeinu passes away on Zayin Adar, or maybe even on Rosh Chodesh Shvat itself. Und wie bald, as Moshe Rabbeinu sagt, Kol ha-mitzvah asher anechi mitzavcha hayoim tishmur un laseis, that all the mitzvahs that I command you, you'll fulfill. Laman tichyun uvasem v'revisem v'vasem v'rishtem esaretz, and therefore you will come and into Eretz Yisrael. As tzilib kiyim from Kol ha-mitzvah, alle mitzvahs, wird me zeiche sein, zu einnehmen Eretz Yisrael. By fulfilling all these mitzvahs, you'll come and conquer the land. So now, is not move on, it's not understood, was the Pasuk sagt, Kol ha-mitzvah. Kol ha-mitzvah simply means all of the mitzvahs. As durch the came von alle Tayag mitzvahs. By fulfilling all of the Tayag mitzvahs, wird später sein, leman tichyon uvasen v'revisem uvasen v'rishtem. You'll come and conquer the land. So the question is, it's not a time period where this is applicable. Sie haben doch demult zwischen Onebs Shvat und der Knisse La'aretz, in this short time period, from the beginning of the month of Shvat until they actually entered into Eretz Yisrael, gekent mekaim sein blois, agar klein itself in the Tayag mitzvahs. They could only fulfill a very small number of the Tayag mitzvahs. Klal nit the mitzvahs atluis baretz. Obviously, they couldn't fulfill any of the mitzvahs that are only dependent on being in Eretz Yisrael. Und euch nit kame v'kame mitzvahs was eine neue b'chutz la'aretz, and also not many mitzvahs that are only relevant in chutz la'aretz, that are relevant in chutz la'aretz, but even those they couldn't fulfill. V'di dinim was eine shaykh zu Yontif und das Gleichen. The halachas of Yontif between the Chodesh Shvat and the time when they entered in Eretz Yisrael before Pesach, there's no Yontif, so all those halachas don't apply either. So the Torah is saying Kol ha-mitzvah, l'chayre referring to all the Tayag mitzvahs. There's no distinction, it just says all mitzvahs, but yet it's in a time period where there's very few mitzvahs that they can fulfill. So what is the Torah speaking about here? That's the question that Rashi is coming to address. Und so zadeiche Gadol sagen, als mit kol ha-mitzvah meint net alle mitzvahs, Now, maybe we would think to say that, wait, even though it says kol ha-mitzvah, it doesn't go on all the taryag mitzvahs, but rather, b'lois di mitzvahs asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'm talking to you about those mitzvahs that I'm commanding you today. There's a specific number of mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu commanded Yidden today. So the Rebbe says it's a deichik gadol to say that that's what it refers to. Varom, because Aleph, number one, favazal basam v'yirishtem es sein dafke in schos von dem kiyum, von den mitzvahs, was hat angesagt, dem Tag, if Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them that you have to have a schos, you have to have the merits to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So you have to do mitzvahs and then you'll be zeicha to enter. Why would only mitzvahs that you're being commanded today be the ones that are schusim to enter? But pashtus, any mitzvah you do gives you a schos. So any mitzvah should contribute to the schos to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So why would we say that Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them specific mitzvahs, chayim, those are the mitzvahs that you enter into Eretz Yisrael? But pashtus, kol ha-mitzvah refers to all of the taryag mitzvahs that give you a schos. Beis, der pirish ha-poshet from mitzavcha hayom is nit der einen einzigen Tag. Even though it does say hayom, but simply it doesn't refer to those mitzvahs that were commanded specifically today. Nor der heintige itztige zman bechlal. Hayom means this time period. Mitzavcha hayom meint kipshutei alle mitzvahs from Mishnah Torah al kolponim. Simply it refers to all mitzvahs, or at least all of those mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu reviews with Yidden in Mishnah Torah. Wie steht früher in Seif Parshas Vaschanan, the same expression you find earlier in Vaschanan, Shamarta, Sa Mitzvah, Sa Chukim, Sa Mishpatim, Asher Anochi Mitzavcha Hayom La'aseisim, which I command you to fulfill today. Was meint kipshutei alle mitzvahs? It says in the Torah Hayom, but it doesn't mean the specific mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu said to them today, but it refers to all mitzvahs. Well, kipshutei literally. Gimel, another point, Oibes al Zagen, as Hayom da meint dafke dem Tag. If we would say that Hayom literally means mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu commanded today, verte shaila, so the question becomes, me weist doch nicht welche sind die mitzvahs, was hat angesagt in jenem Tag. The Torah does not tell us what are those mitzvahs that he commands today. The Torah is telling us what Moshe Rabbeinu said to Yidden, those mitzvahs that I'm commanding you today, they are the specific mitzvahs that will give you the merit to enter into Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't say what they are. Oneich nicht welche Tag, says doubled given, and Bechlal, we don't even know which day this was. When the Torah writes something with such an ambiguous expression, so the Torah is not coming to speak about something very specific, and it doesn't spell out what specifically that is. If the Torah speaks in these general broad terms, the mitzvahs which I'm commanding you today, so the reason why it doesn't specify is because it's speaking about Bechlal, all mitzvahs. If the Torah would come to say something specifically, so then it would tell you what specifically that is. So therefore we go back to the premise of the Rebbe said before, Kol ha-mitzvah l'chayre refers to all taryag mitzvahs. So what does this mean if we're talking about a time period where there's only very few mitzvahs that Yidden could fulfill? The Rebbe is Rashi mefarish Kol ha-mitzvah kepshutei. So Rashi explains that Kol ha-mitzvah, first of all, the pshat is literally. Abavarint as medarf mefarish sein Kol ha-mitzvah alle mitzvahs. Kol ha-mitzvah, yes, in the simple pshat, does refer to all mitzvahs. And the Rebbe again bewarnt that the ha-mitzvah Lashon Yachid is not an issue. Wie mir gefindt, as a Lashon Yachid wird benutzt als Shem Hamin, was is Kailol, a Ribui Pratim, as the Rebbe quoted before in the Ha'ara from the Ra'am, that Kol ha-mitzvah, even though it refers to all mitzvahs, but because it's all referring to one category, the mitzvahs of the Eibishter, so therefore it could be written in a singular term. Hagam says nitgar glatt einlernen. Even though it's not so smooth to learn it in the pshat over here in the pasuk, but that it's what that we call a mitzvah, one mitzvah, refers to all the mitzvahs, but nevertheless, that's the simple pshat over here that Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to Yidden about all taryag mitzvahs, and he's telling them that all the mitzvahs you will fulfill will bring you the schos to enter into Eretz Yisrael. But now, the point is, if kol ha-mitzvahs refers to all taryag mitzvahs, it doesn't fit over here into this time period, into this short time period. Und lefizeh is der pirish kol ha-mitzvah nit alle taryag mitzvahs. So it can't actually refer to all 613 mitzvahs. Nor alle mitzvahs, was die Yidden haben a Möglichkeit, sie zum Mekayim sein bis der Knisse Laretz. It only refers to all of the mitzvahs which could be fulfilled in this time period until they enter into Eretz Yisrael. That's the first pshat. That's kipshutai. So Rashi is addressing. So even though usually Rashi does not come to address this issue of ha mitzvah loshen yachid, but because over here there's no time to fulfill all mitzvahs. Maybe you would think over here ha mitzvah refers to one specific mitzvah. So Rashi has to address that. No, even here kol ha mitzvah. The Teire loiba kasav listim elo lefarish. So even here kol ha mitzvah refers to all mitzvahs. Elamai b'poila doesn't refer to all taryag mitzvahs because that's not applicable here, but it refers to all of mitzvahs that could be fulfilled in this time period. But it's still very difficult to learn the pasuk this way. Kanal, as we pointed out before, as der loshen kol mitzvah is shema min versus kail ala mitzvahs on unterschied. On one hand, kol mitzvah is referring to all mitzvahs together, all of them. It's that category that refers to everything, all taryag. But in actuality, it's only referring to a small minority of mitzvahs that are relevant in that time. So that's the problem with this pshat. The Rebbe bringt Rashi at zweiten Pirish, so therefore Rashi brings another pshat. That kol over here means you should fulfill the whole mitzvah. If you began a mitzvah, complete the mitzvah. Was lefizeh is kol ha-mitzvah nit ken shema min von klolos ha-mitzvahs. It's not that name, the expression that refers to all mitzvahs, nor das meint die Ganzkeit von a mitzvah kanal, the entirety of a mitzvah that you should fulfill, the entire mitzvah. That's what brings Rashi to the second pshat of the Medrash. Es ist aber nicht verstandig. So now Rashi doesn't just stop over here, just telling us that kol ha-mitzvah refers to the mitzvah in its entirety. Because the question here is as follows. Was für a Sheiches hat ot der Zivui auf zu geime sein, a mitzvah, zu the Knisse La'aretz? What's the connection of this concept? That when a person begins a mitzvah, he should see through the mitzvah to the end and fulfill it in its entirety, to what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying here, that in this merit they'll enter into Eretz Yisrael. As b'schuz gmar mitzvahs, that come in the Knisse, they'll be able to enter into Eretz Yisrael. In other words, Rashi, as the Rebbe pointed out here, is addressing the words kol ha-mitzvah in the context of the whole parsha, of what Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking about. We're speaking about the schus to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So just like the Rebbe pointed out before, that it doesn't really make sense to say that kol ha-mitzvah refers to specific mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking about today. Every mitzvah is a schus. Every mitzvah you do is a schus to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So if kol ha-mitzvah means this specific concept of completing a mitzvah, what's unique about that, which Moshe Rabbeinu says, this is the schos of entering to Eretz Yisrael? The Rebbe bringt Rashi dem Hemshech mit alle pratim. Therefore Rashi brings the continuation, and with all the details, she'en in the kras ha-mitzvah ela al shem ha-goimra shenem ha-chulukit lekaman, as the Rebbe will explain how all the details that Rashi brings, and the example specifically from carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim is relevant over here for the situation that Yidden are in and to be zeichet to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe gives here an introduction to explain what is going on here. Kibush v'yirushas Eretz Yisrael durch the Yidden, conquering and inheriting the land of Eretz Yisrael through Yidden, chach adas es gekommen zu lieb der Shvue asher nishba Hashem la v'seichem. So of course Yidden receive this because of the promise, the Shvur, that Eibusher made to Avraham, Yitzchak and Yaakov. Is this aber euch gewen verbunden mit den Kiyam HaMitzvahs von den Yidden HaKoivshim? It is, however, connected and relying upon the Yidden themselves meriting this by fulfilling the mitzvahs. Wie Moshe sagt befeirish in the pasuk, as Moshe Rabbeinu here clearly says that it's dependent upon the Yidden to fulfill mitzvahs, that they have to deserve this. And we see this also from the history of what happened before, was the Faz Zetman, as chosh is given the Shvur zu Davis. Yes, there was the Shvur. Hat aber der Chet am Meraglen Geirim given, as jene dort is nicht an in Eretz Yisrael. But when exactly this Shvur is going to be fulfilled is dependent on the Yidden at that time period. Deir am Meraglen that weren't Zeiche did not enter into Eretz Yisrael. Und das kommt da der Pasuk sagt. So that's the context of these psukim over here, what it's coming to say. Falpi, as euch die Yidden from friedlichen Dörf von der Arbaim Shana, even though all the Yidden that were from the previous generation that spent the 40 years in the Midbar, haben bekaim gewen mitzvahs. They also fulfilled mitzvahs. So they definitely did things that contributed to this chos to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Und damit zugeholfen zu der Eufen Knisse Eretz Yisrael. So they also contributed. Nevertheless, the mitzvah, in other words, the ultimate schus that brings you into Eretz Yisrael, who is the one that we attribute that schus that did? Oh, they are the ones that did the mitzvah that brings Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. It's the one that's the ones that completed. Die Yidden, was haben sich gefunden, besoif shnas arbaim, that were there at the end of the 40 years. Zu sein dafke, zu sei dafke, that is, sagt Moshe, kol ha-mitzvah tishmor and lasses leman goymer, that they are going to fulfill the mitzvahs because you're going to enter as bias ha'aretz, v'yirusha ha'aretz, werden aufgetan in schos von seire mitzvahs. Coming into Eretz Yisrael will be in the schos of their mitzvahs. In other words, the chiddush that the Rebbe is saying over here in this concept, in this paragraph, as you see in the ha'aretz, is you may have thought that whatever happened with the previous generation, the mitzvahs that they fulfilled while they were in the mitzvah, that wasn't the haschala of the schusim and the mitzvahs to bring Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. Adarabah, they were not zeichet to enter. They were part of Chet HaMeraglim, and therefore they died in the midbar. Now, the Yidden, the next generation that's about to enter into Eretz Yisrael, they're a new generation that are going to do mitzvahs to be zeichet to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe says, no, that's not the case. Definitely, even the mitzvahs that the Yidden did before the previous generation also contributed to the schus of Klal Yisrael to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Elamai, because of the Chet HaMeraglim, they weren't zeichet to complete it. So they didn't actually come. But the Yidden, the next generation that Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to now, they're going to be the ones that are going to continue and complete and bring Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. So this whole subject that Rashi is bringing here from the Medrash, when you get to the taich of Kol HaMitzvah, is actually negeya. This is exactly the situation that Yidden are found in over here right now, completing the mitzvahs to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So with them is verstandig was in Kol HaMitzvah leman, this what Moshe Rabbeinu says, that when you fulfill the whole mitzvah, according to the way the Medrash teaches, and because of this you'll enter into Eretz Yisrael, is mudgish der inyan von im Eschalte b'mitzvah gemoiraisa. That the point here that the pasuk is saying, according to the Medrash, that if you begin a mitzvah, you should complete it. The mit wird angesagt, as the knisa la'aretz is dafke durich kol ha-mitzvah. Here, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them that to enter into Eretz Yisrael, it's only through you fulfill the whole mitzvah, which means durich dem was is gaimra, the one that will complete, even if the Yidden are going to be doing right now in this time period, b'soif shnas arbaim. So maybe in the quantity of mitzvahs that they're going to do, it's much less than all the mitzvahs that were fulfilled during the 40 years, but nevertheless, they are the ones that are going to complete it, and we attribute everything to them. Divas haben geime gewend the kiyama mitzvahs b'siyum shnas arbaim, the ones that complete it at the conclusion of the 40th year. That's the pshat why Rashi brings this the connection of this inyan of him haschalta b'mitzvah gemayraisa to what the Yidden are actually completing right now. Move on. So according to this, we understand another geschmacke thing here. As the Medrash HaGodeh is nit meitzim mipshute legamri umevatel dem pirish haposhet and kol mitzvah. This is a Medrash take, but Rashi only brings Medrashim that can fit into the pshat of the pasuk. So l'chayre, this Medrash kol ha-mitzvah is not the usual way, the way you translate of kol ha-mitzvah, that the pashtus it refers to fulfilling all mitzvahs. So the Medrash says kol here means the whole mitzvah. So simply it seems like the Medrash is negating pshat. So the Rebbe says no. Weil oich, again, it's not meitzim mipshuta in pirish haposhet in kol ha-mitzvah, that means all mitzvahs. Weil oich leuten pirish from Medrash HaGodeh meint es nit blois ein mitzvah. The Medrash is not saying that the Torah here is telling you one mitzvah that you're doing, do that one mitzvah in its entirety. No. No yederin von alle mitzvahs, the Torah here is referring to each of all of those mitzvahs that Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them in this time period that they should fulfill. Die alle mitzvahs is Yidden haben bekeim gewinnt. In Meshach von der Arbaim schon aber midbar. So, all of the mitzvahs that were fulfilled during the 40 years werden verrechnet als mitzvahs von dem Dor, was haben geime gewinnt, die mitzvahs fahr die Knisa Laretz. It's all attributed to this generation, and right now in this short time period where they complete and do those mitzvahs that are going to bring them the actual schos to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So all the mitzvahs, again, it refers to all the mitzvahs that were the Yidden were Mekayim and all the time. So when the Medrash says this concept of mischalta b'mitzvah gemayraisa, it's talking about all mitzvahs, like the simple pshat of the pasuk. But legabi this gufa, it's talking about all the mitzvahs in this time period over here. And it's saying that now Yidden are going to be fulfilling mitzvahs and they are going to get the name, their name, it attributes to them all of the mitzvahs that were fulfilled in all the 40 years. So that's the pshat and the medrash, and that's the connection to this time period that the Yidden are in. But now there's a question though. The question is, could you really apply this concept over here in this situation? That the Yidden, we attribute to them everything that was fulfilled in the 40 years? So it's understood regarding the Yidden of the 40 years that were connected to the Aveir of the Meraglim. They refused to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Is move on, it's understood, Favos, Zeire mitzvahs werden, bescheiches zu knisa la'oretz, gerechend nit al Zeire, not al Shem von the Yidden, was an rein in Eretz Yisrael. So those people, we understand, they were not interested in going into Eretz Yisrael. They fulfilled many mitzvahs, but they refused to complete it. They refused to complete those mitzvahs to enter into Eretz Yisrael. So therefore those that complete the mitzvah and want to go into Eretz Yisrael, so they're the ones that we attribute this chusim of these mitzvahs to actually enter into Eretz Yisrael to them. They refused to enter. They caused that Yidden should remain in the midbar for 40 years, and therefore, how could we attribute this chusim of their mitzvahs that contributed to entering into Eretz Yisrael to them when they didn't want to enter? So we attribute it to those Yidden that actually completed it and came into Eretz Yisrael. Aber die Yidden was dann nicht gewähnt bei Tzachas mit dem Meraglim. Those Yidden that were not involved in this whole story of the Meraglim. Und seine gestorben in Midbar, and they died in that generation, in the Midbar. Nor the far was they seine gewähnt in Klal Gzeire, only because they were included in the general Gzeire that they Eibishter decreed upon that generation. Zayndik me esrem shana l'mayla, being 20 and older, in Yenim Zman in that time period. And so therefore they didn't enter. The entire generation passed away in the Midbar. Verwasseln seire mitzvahs nicht verrechnet werden als azelche, was haben zugeholfen zu der Knisa Loretz. Why shouldn't we attribute to them as well that they also helped and brought Yidden into Eretz Yisrael? How can we say that we don't attribute this chus to them at all? In a situation where there's a person that begins a mitzvah, does a part, but he doesn't want to complete it, so then we can understand why we don't attribute the completion to him. But if someone wants to complete it and then he's not given the opportunity, the Eibishter makes excited that the whole generation has to die, so why shouldn't we consider theirs chusim to be part of the contribution to Eretz Yisrael? We get asked the same question in reverse regarding the generation that actually comes into Eretz Yisrael. The Yidden was eine be'esak Gzeire gewähnt, jünger von Esrem Shana. Those Yidden at the time of the Gzeire by the Meraglim were younger than 20. Aber euch sei haben nicht gewollt da reingehen in Eretz Yisrael. They were there then, someone could have been 19 years old, and he also didn't want to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Aber if they had mitchal gewinnt die Gzeire von der Meraglim, but because of their age, so on these people, the Gzeire of the Eibishter did not take effect, und sie sind rein in Eretz Yisrael, and they did end up going into Eretz Yisrael. Verwas soll sein die Kras ha-mitzvah al-shmam? Why should I say that the mitzvah and the completion of entering Eretz Yisrael is contributed to them, even though b'payil they were there later and they fulfilled mitzvahs later and they entered into Eretz Yisrael, but they were no different than the rest of the generation earlier that did not want to go into Eretz Yisrael. And nevertheless we say that since b'payil they did enter, we attribute the schus and the mitzvah to bring in Eretz Yisrael to them. So therefore, Rashi has to continue and bring the details what we learn out from what happened with Atzmas Yosef, Moshe, and the Yidden to show us a source for this concept here, how it applies now to the Yidden entering the Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe bringt Rashi, Shenema, Ves Atzmas Yosef, Goymer, and Vahaloi Moshe Levada in Esasik Bem La Loisam, El Lefi Shaloi Hispik Legoymra Vegamru Yisrael. And Rashi specifically brings why Moshe did not bring Atzmas Yosef into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe didn't manage to bring it. It wasn't his fault. So from the fact that over there we also say the same idea, that Eina Mitzvah Nikras El Al Shem Goimra, so we understand how it applies in our case. So we understand over here two details. Aleph, says Kenchilik nit, Was is gewend die Sibbe, Zelieb welche hat nicht geime gewend der Mitzvah. It doesn't matter what the cause is that you did not complete the mitzvah. Afile wenn das ist durch Hanaynis, even if it's of no fault of your own. Wie bei Meishen, le hispik le geimra. He didn't manage to complete it. Wird die Mitzvah fort angerufen, not al shem geimra. Nevertheless, you look at the bottom line, at the facts, the mitzvah then is attributed to the one that actually had the schos to complete it. That's one point you see. The situation, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Einis, doesn't matter. You look at the B'Payel Mamish, the one that actually completed the mitzvah. Another point you learn from there, on al derech zel idach, chach as Moshe levadai nesasik behem. It was only Moshe Rabbeinu that took care of this, to take him out of Mitzrayim. Das heißt, als von der Yetze Mitzrayim, Jinger von Esrim Shana, was haben später hereingebracht, die Atzmes Yosef in Eretz Yisrael und sie Keive gewen beschem. Amongst those Yidden that came into Eretz Yisrael were there then in Mitzrayim with Moshe Rabbeinu. They were younger than 20 years old by the time of the Gzeira of the Meraglim, so they lived and they actually entered Eretz Yisrael. Haben beis Mitzias Mitzrayim nicht gewollt helfen Moshe. They refused to help Moshe Rabbeinu then. And there is Askos Areisenam Yosef from Mitzrayim, in taking Yosef out of Mitzrayim. So it's not only that they fulfilled the mitzvah, they completed it later, but in the beginning they refused to do this. Since in the end they were the ones that got to complete and bring Yosef into Eretz Yisrael and bury him there, so we attribute the mitzvah to them. So that's the reverse point that we see regarding Yidden. So it doesn't matter why Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't fulfill it, even if it wasn't Einis. Nevertheless, we don't attribute the mitzvah to him. And the Yidden that did do it, and they refused to do it in the beginning, nevertheless, we do attribute the mitzvah to them because they actually completed it. Al derech zeh is oich benidin dinan. So we apply, and therefore Rashi is bringing this, that we apply this over here regarding the situation of the Yidden here entering into Eretz Yisrael. In the Knesset law, it's Aleph number 1, it says Nikras al Shem HaGoimra. We attribute the mitzvah to the one that completes it, the ones that came into Eretz Yisrael. Oich klapidi v'zenen nit arai mitzad anaynis. Nit selib zeh shul. Even in contrast to those that couldn't enter into Eretz Yisrael. They did mitzvahs, they contribute to the Yidden entering into Eretz Yisrael, but they couldn't complete it. And it was of no fault of their own. They had no shaychus tatzas meraglim. It was an aynis. Nevertheless, the fact is they didn't complete it. We don't attribute the mitzvah to them. And Beis, and the other point, says Nikras al Shem HaGoimra. We attribute the mitzvah to the ones that completed the schusim to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Afila Shem al Zah, even for those was hat frier nit blois nit angeheben tondim mitzvah, nor hat getondem hepech. Even those Yidden that may have been part of Atzasa Meraglim, but they were just underage and therefore the Gzeira didn't apply to them. So nevertheless, the pile, they ended up entering into Eretz Yisrael and completing the mitzvahs to enter. We attribute the mitzvahs to them, that they were the schos that brought going into Eretz Yisrael. But Pizez move on bepashtos, was Rashi bringt dafke, und nor dem Minyan she'ene nekras ha-mitzvah ela al Shem HaGoimra. Why Rashi specifically brings, and only this, that it says here, that a mitzvah is attributed to the one that completes it, und bringt die Reihe der Ruf von Moshe. And why Rashi brings the proof of this, specifically from this, with Moshe and the Yidden regarding carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim. Und nicht der Inyan von Meriden Neise v'chulu, and not what it says by Yehuda, that's l'chayre much more powerful, much more severe. Kanal v'haraya von Yehuda. Warum? So the point is, da is nit negeya the chaymere Inyan von nit geime sein die angehebene mitzvah. Rashi, by bringing this whole ariches, is not simply coming to tell you how severe and how important this is. That's not Rashi's pshutishal mikra. Rashi doesn't have to explain the reason for this and the severity of the subject. Does negeya der Inyan as nekras al Shem HaGoimra. Rashi wants to tell you the extent of how far we take this concept, that we attribute the mitzvah to the one that completes it, and the way it's relevant now for this generation that's entering into Eretz Yisrael, that this applies even in a situation where the one that began couldn't complete even because of an einus, of no choice of his own. So that's the only reason why Rashi is bringing up the example from Moshe and the Yidden with Yosef, because that's applicable over here to explain why Dafke the Yidden that entered in the Eretz Yisrael have the schus, and not all the Yidden before that also contributed. as the Rabbi explained. Apia now, based on all of this, we can answer another question in Rashi, which the Rabbi did not bring up in the beginning of the Sikha. Seemingly, in the language of Rashi, what Rashi says in the beginning is not similar to what he says afterwards, and what he says in the end is not the same to what he says in the beginning. Rashi hyped on in the Pirish from Medrash Agadah. The way Rashi begins, quoting the Medrash, is if you began a mitzvah, you must complete it. Was von dem Lashon is mashma. So from this expression, it seems as es don dem achiv mitzvah. It's an obligation. It's a mitzvah. You begin, see it through to the end. Gemar, it's a command. You should see it through to the end. Und danach is a mamshech. But then Rashi continues, she'eino nekras a mitzvah elo al shem hagoimra, because you don't call the mitzvah upon anyone, only the one that completes it. Das heißt, now from this completion, it seems. As es blois an inyan was es leinten. This is just something which you can gain from it. If you want the mitzvah to be attributed to you, so then complete it. The mitzvah soll angerufen werden als Shmai. Just for this reason. It's not an obligation, it's not a must, but it's just in order if you wanted to have it attributed to you. And if it doesn't matter to you that the mitzvah will not be attributed to your name, is mashma as is netakim muz as dafke ez lo goyim. It's not a must that you should be the one to conclude it. So in the beginning, Rashi says gemar, you have to finish it, and then Rashi says if you want it to be attributed to your name. So what's going on over here? But now based on the way we explained before, the whole context of what Rashi is bringing this over here is because it's negayah to the matzav that Yidden were themselves in at that point. As the Hemshech in Rashi, she'ein nekras cholo, kumt mazbe sein, nor die shayches lenidden die don. Rashi is coming to explain how this is relevant right now for the Yidden. Is this move on? So we understand what Rashi is saying here. Benigayat zum maschala mitzvah, regarding to the person that begins a mitzvah, is takedoa chiyuv to goyim sein the mitzvah. There's an obligation that he has to see to it to complete the mitzvah. That's the beginning, the way Rashi starts quoting from the Medrash. But that's not the application to what Rashi wants to say here in our point. Here we're talking about the generation that's entering into Eretz Yisrael. They're not the maschilim. They're not the ones that are starting. They're the ones that are completing. So therefore Rashi continues to address them. Aber der Pirish Rashi is eisen zu madgish sein, der Chiddush by the Goyma mitzvah. Rashi here wants to say regarding one that completes a mitzvah, that we attribute the mitzvah to him, to what extent that goes, how far we take that point that we attribute the mitzvah to the one that completed it. That even if the one that began was only did not complete it because of an einus, or not nit gekent goyim sein, he couldn't complete it. Wie benitten die done, like it was over here. Die was nit rein in Eretz Yisrael. Mitzat gzeres HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was a decree from the Eibishter, und al derech wie bei Moshe Rabbeinu, just like by Moshe Rabbeinu. Afal pikein vert the mitzvah farachin blois al shem hagoyimra. Nevertheless, we attribute the mitzvah only to the ones that completed it. So Rashi over here is coming to say how this concept applies over here, benegay to these Yidden, the special schos that Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them that they have. That although you may think that there's many exceptions to this, you have to look at the cause of why the one that started didn't complete, and you have to also look at the ones that completed. Did they have the opportunity to begin the mitzvah or not? So Rashi, no. The main emphasis of Rashi bringing this is not to minimize the obligation of the one that starts to complete. Of course it's an obligation. But here Rashi is coming to explain the extent of the goymer, that there's no exceptions to this. Regardless of why the maschel didn't finish, and regardless of why the goymer did not start, ein a mitzvah nikras el al shem ha-goymra, that the mitzvah is only attributed to those that complete it. And that's relevant over here to explain for the Yidden that did the mitzvahs that brought Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. So this is the conclusion of the pshat part of the Sicheb, and again to explaining how every single detail in this Rashi is necessary perfectly to explain the pshutish and mikra of Kol HaMitzvah. Now, from the Inyanim of Floim, was me gefunden in Pirish Rashi. The Rebbe refers to this always as the Inyanim of Floim. It's an expression from the Shalach Kodesh, from the very wondrous things that we find over here in Rashi that are more related in the area of halacha, not necessarily so much in pshutish and mikra. Rashi sagt the lashon al derech vi in Tanchuma. Rashi uses the expression that it says, similar in the Medrash, she'ein nekras ha-mitzvah ela al shem ha-goimra, that we only call the mitzvah upon the name of the person that completed it. In Gemara aber is der lashon, the Gemara says this as well, but there's a different expression. Maila olav ha-kasuv al shegomroi ki'ilu asoi. The Torah considers the one that completed the mitzvah as if he did the entire mitzvah. Two different expressions and not exactly the same. The time was dafke der lashon nikras al shem ha-goimra. Vi in Medrash is masim lepshuta shel mikra. Why is it that specifically this expression of the Medrash is more fitting over here into the pshat of the pasuk? Unit ki'ilu asoi vi in Gemara, and not the expression the Gemara says that we consider the one that completed it as if he did the entire mitzvah, like it says in the Gemara. So first the Rebbe in the brackets here brings simply, das was Rashi bringt bechlal, dem Lashon HaMedrash, and not dem Lashon HaGemara. The reason why Rashi is quoting from the Medrash and not from the Gemara is the Tam b'Pashta. So that the reason for that is very simple. In Gemara, redt sich nicht wegen dem Pasuk Kol HaMitzvah. The Pasuk Gemara is not even talking about this Pasuk here. Und so wird bechlal nicht dem Mond Mitzvah. The Gemara doesn't even mention bechlal, the expression of a mitzvah, nor one that does something positive, and he starts something and he doesn't complete it, so the Torah considers as if the one that completed it did the whole thing. So it's not even talking about this pasuk or not even a mitzvah. Mashenken in Medrash steht der Lashon mitzvah und in Sheiches zu dem pasuk. The Medrash, however, is speaking about the Kol HaMitzvah of our pasuk. Wie bald Rashi stellt sich auf dem pasuk, und im is es negei legabi the mitzvahs von Deutsch und Nichnas Alaretz. Rashi, of course, is explaining this pasuk, and he's also explaining the mitzvahs that the Yidden are going to fulfill. The Rebbe sagt the Lashon vi in Medrash, so therefore Rashi quotes the Medrash. So that's simply why Rashi quotes the Medrash and not the Gemara. But also the specific difference in these two expressions, Ein mitzvah nekras el al shem ha-goimra, and Mayl olav ha-kosov ki'ilu asoi. Al shegomrei ki'ilu asoi. There's a big difference between them, as the Rabbi will now explain. Yeshloima, we can say, as benidden di done over here in our case, Chotch is nikras ha-mitzvah al shem ha-goimra. Yes, we attribute the mitzvah to the one that completed it. Kemen aber al pi pashtus advarim nid sagen ados es ki'ilu asoi. But nevertheless, in the simple pshat of what happened here, we can't say that we'll go a step further and say that the Torah considers the one that completed it as if he did everything. Asoi. Asoi is much more than just nikras. Nikras means your part of the mitzvah was the end. There are two parts of the mitzvah. There's the first part of the mitzvah and the end part of the mitzvah. And you only did the end of the mitzvah. You befeidish did not do the first part of the mitzvah. Between the two, what's more significant? That the Eibishter considers that will say that we attribute, who should we attribute the mitzvah to? We attribute it to the second half, to the one that completes it. The completion is the most important part, so we attribute it to you. But we don't say that it's as if you did the first part. The first part you befeidish didn't you didn't do, that is. We attribute it, though, the name of the mitzvah to the one that completes it, because that's more chashuv. But not kilo asoi. As es gleich wie nor hat getan die mitzvah und der andere hat dazu kein Scheiches nicht. And therefore the other one that started the mitzvah does not have any connection to this mitzvah now, because it's as if you did the entire mitzvah. In other words, what the Rebbe is saying over here is, the difference between these two lashonos are, if you say nikras al shem ha-goimra, so we're not saying that this mitzvah is exclusively yours. No, there's befeidish two parts of the mitzvah. There's the first part and there's the second part. And there's a maschel here. Elamai between the two of them, because your part is more chashuv, that you completed it, so we attribute the mitzvah to you. But there is a maschel, he did his part. Mashenkin, if you say, Ma'il olav hakosav kilo asoi, so what we're saying is, it's not only that we attribute it to you, but it's exclusively yours. We're negating the maschel, as if the maschel's part that he did is not relevant. It's all yours. So that, we don't go so far in this case over here. We're not completely negating the maschel. And the reason is, the Rebbe says that al pi pashtus advarim, simply in our context, in our parsha, because over here, the maschilim amongst them were those that befeidish wanted to continue going into Eretz Yisrael. It was an einus that they couldn't. And those goimrim Could be that they even refused to begin the mitzvahs. They did not want to go into Eretz Yisrael. And nevertheless, in this case, we say that Eina mitzvah nekras al shem ha-goimra. In such a kind of situation, it doesn't make sense to say that we're going to completely negate the one that's the maschil and say that the goimer, that didn't even want to be a maschil, that it's as if he does the entire thing. Maybe in the context of the Gemara, where it speaks about a situation where the maschil was not an einus, and the goimer wanted to do the haschala, but he couldn't for whatever reason. Over there, maybe you could say that he did the entire mitzvah. But in this context, it doesn't make sense that we're negating completely the chusim of the maschil. To say this in a different way, so then in them dot zwei pratim. There are two details over here. Das was nekras ha-mitzvah al shem ha-goimra. This expression of the medrash that Rashi quotes, that the mitzvah is attributed to the one that completes it. We're speaking about, we're focusing on this goimer, that we attribute the mitzvah to him. We're not speaking about him in contrast to the maschil, to negate the maschil. We're saying that he has more of a chashuva part, so we attribute the mitzvah to him. What's with the maschil? What the maschil did is he's irrelevant, there's nothing, no. Regarding the one that started the mitzvah, he has an obligation to complete it. Aber even if he didn't do that, even the fact that he just began, and especially, that's the point there, in this situation that he could not complete it, it was out of his control, is an asiyah from the mitzvah mitzidai. There definitely is an asiyah of a mitzvah over here. There is a part of a mitzvah that he did. So therefore, in this context, we can't apply the lashon of the Gemara on the gaimer ki'ilu asa oi, that he did the beginning, which is expression that negates the zechos of the first person. No, we're befedish not negating his aschala. We're just attributing the mitzvah as a whole to the one that completed, because his part is more chashuv. So from this we take out something also that's relevant in actuality. From pashtus haloshen im mischalta b'mitzvah gemoiraisa is muchach. From this expression that if you begin a mitzvah, you should complete it. It's clear. As from kol mitzvah lernt narois nar the chiyuv. The Torah over here is telling you the obligation. As oiber hat angeheben ton, dafür es verendigen. That if you began doing a mitzvah, then you should see it through to the end to complete it. Aber nicht der Minyan, as oiber kennet ton die ganze mitzvah soll man nicht anheben, soll man gar nicht anheben. But you don't see anywhere over here in this lashon that if you can't complete a mitzvah, don't even begin it. Don't even begin a mitzvah that you know that you can't complete. No, befedish not. If there's something that you could start and you're not sure if you'll be able to complete it, you should anyways go ahead and start it. So the point over here is, based on what the Rebbe said before, that when there's a situation of an eines and the person that began couldn't complete the mitzvah, we don't apply the lashon of Chazal, kilo asoi, that the whole asiyah of the mitzvah is only for the gaimer. And everything that the maschil did is not his at all. It's only the gaimer's. If that would have been the situation, then maybe we would say, if you can't complete the mitzvah, don't even start it, because it's not you're doing nothing. The whole asiyah is the other person's asiyah. But from the fact that there's the other lashon that Rashi quotes, that we attribute the asiyah, we attribute the name of the mitzvah, that is, we attribute the name of the mitzvah to the gaimer. But we're not negating the schus of the maschil. The aschal is also something. So therefore, in a situation where you have an opportunity to begin a mitzvah and you're not sure if you'll be able to see it through to the end, you should definitely go ahead and begin it. According to this, we could simply understand something else. Was Rashi sagt from Gemara, from Pasuk, that Rashi says in last week's Parsha, the Gemara says in the Pasuk, Oz Yavdul Moshe Shalish Arim Be'eva Yarden. That Moshe Rabbeinu separated the three cities for the Ir Miklot and the Ever Yarden. And the Rashi there says, even though these cities, he could not complete the mitzvah that they should actually be active to absorb the people that have to go there. Until you you separate the other ones in Eretz Yisrael. Nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu says, a mitzvah that I have an opportunity to do, a part of it now, I'll fulfill it. So what do we see here? As of at the Havdalas are Miklat Nit Kana Farendigen, Moshe Rabbeinu knew right from the beginning that he will not be able to complete this mitzvah. Mafir sein euch die drei Are Miklat in Eretz Yisrael, and separate the other three Are Miklat in Eretz Yisrael. So nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu began. Zet men davon as euch has cholas a mitzvah is a chelek und an Inyan in Kiyum Vasiyas HaMitzvah. As far as the action that the Maschel is doing, we're not taking away the schos of that action. It's also something that he began. Even if you know in advance that you will not have the ability to complete the mitzvah. So this is a very important practical lesson for someone that may say to himself, based on this Rashi, you can take the Rashi in the positive, that if I complete something, so then, I should have the motivation to complete, even if I didn't begin, because the mitzvah will be attributed to me. So the Rebbe is saying, but don't take the negative regarding a maschel, that if you can't complete it, then you shouldn't even begin. No. You should begin something even knowing that you won't be able to complete it. Another thing that we can take from over here from this subject, from everything we explained in the Rashi, a different point. As nidden di don hat kein shayches nit zu the shakel v'tarya yedua. That our situation, and the point that Rashi here says, Eina mitzvah nekras el al shem gaimra, is not connected to another well-known discussion in the Paiskim. And that is, tzia Chelek von shir or der ma'isa mitzvah, if you have just a part of the amount or the action of a mitzvah, was one is mechuyev that you're obligated to fulfill, it's a chiyuv, is farzicha tel from the mitzvah. Is that a part of a mitzvah? Is that also something significant? Und es liegt auf dem Achiyuv zu mekayin sein dem Chelek. And therefore, even if you can't do the full mitzvah, you'll have an obligation to do at least half of the mitzvah, half of the action of the mitzvah, or half of the shir of the mitzvah, or the nit. Or maybe it's either all or nothing. Ula dugma, and the example for this is, Essen a halbe kezayis matzah v'chayetze b'zeh. To eat a half a kezayis matzah. If all you have is a half a kezayis matzah, is there any point in eating a half a kezayis of matzah? Or maybe no, maybe a half a kezayis matzah is worthless, it's nothing. That's the question. So you may think that this is connected to this Maim B'Chazal, that Eina mitzvah nikras, Ela al Shem HaGoimra. And Memela, what this means is that if I'm doing part of the mitzvah and I don't complete it, so I don't have the mitzvah. The mitzvah is not attributed to me, B'chlal. So the Rebbe says, no, it has no shaykhs whatsoever to this Maim B'Chazal. Why? Varum, because Neisef Alanal, in addition to the point that we just made over here, that the Rebbe just explained in the previous sif, as Lefi Pirish Rashi meint nit, in Mischalte b'mitzvah gemoiraisa, as the aschala von a mitzvah is nit a chelik von the mitzvah. We're not saying that the beginning, the first part of the action of the mitzvah is nothing at all for that person that did it, and everything is attributed, the whole Maisa mitzvah kilo asa is attributed to the second person. That's not what Rashi is saying. Rashi says that the name of the mitzvah is attributed to the second person. Right? So that's number one. But besides that, is the shakla v'tarya now, the whole discussion in Paiskim regarding fulfilling a half a mitzvah is b'negeya mitzvahs v'zen chayvas hayachid. It's an obligation that lies upon an individual. Und der chiyuv tzetan die ganze mitzvah, and he has an obligation to fulfill the mitzvah in its entirety. That's the discussion there. Mashen kein da, but in this context of this Rashi, retzich wegen azeliche mitzvahs was is nit kein chiyuv auf ihm befrat zu tun sei. It's not a specific mitzvah that lies upon him specifically to fulfill. Nor lepayil hat ze angeheben zu tun. His chalta b'mitzvah. You're talking about a mitzvah that lies upon the tzibur, upon everybody to fulfill. And you went and grabbed the opportunity and began doing it. Chalta b'mitzvah. Was done, so then you say, im is chalta b'mitzvah. That's the expression, if. In other words, it's something that was your choice, it wasn't an obligation. So then, gemairaisa, you should complete it, you should see it through to the end. Once you began it, now you have an obligation to complete it. That's the whole chiddush here. In other words, we're talking about a kind of mitzvah. It wasn't your obligation, b'chlal. It's a mitzvah that lies upon the tzibur. Something has to get done. Who's going to do it? The tzibur. Someone has to do it. So you don't have an obligation. But once you began, now it's an obligation, gemaira. So you should see it through to the end. That's what Rashi is talking about. So it's two different subjects. Al derech vi by atzmas Yosef, like you find by the story of carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim. Was hashbeya hishbiya as bnei Yisrael leimoy pocket yifkad lekim eschem valisem es atzmoisem mizeh itchem, that Yosef made a shvur with the Yidden that they should carry him out of Mitzrayim. The Ashba v'chiv was given if all Yidden b'shava. So this was with all Yidden equally. As Mizal Reis named the Atzmus Yosef from Mitzrayim to carry out his bones from Mitzrayim. But once Moshe Rabbeinu took this mitzvah and he began it. Vayikach Moshe es atzmus Yosef imay. Es scheint auf ihm befragt, gewend der Chiyuv zu gehen sein die Maisa Mitzvah. Once you begin, now it becomes yours specifically. Now you have to complete it. Und wie bald as lehispik legoimra, and because he did not manage to complete it, mitzad ha'eines, not of any fault of his own, v'gamru b'nei Yisrael, and he didn't complete it, the far is in the kras al shmam. So therefore the name of the mitzvah is attributed to the Yidden. That's the subject of what this concept of a maschel b'mitzvah, oimrim loy gemoir, is speaking about. But now the question is, so if that's the context of this concept, so what's taka the reason for this? If it's something which was taka not a chiyuv, and you went ahead on your own choice and decided to begin it, so just because I began it, now all of a sudden it transforms into an obligation? Why? So the explanation in this we can explain as follows. Regarding those mitzvahs that are an obligation of the tzibur b'chlal, there's no specific person that has this obligation. Is b'shas einer hoypton ton, when one person begins doing the mitzvah, vert al derech v'yashliach, he becomes like the shliach. Similar, even though he wasn't appointed by anybody, but now that he began it, he becomes like a shliach from the ganzen tzibur in the mitzvah, for the entire congregation, for everyone to fulfill this. Und b'meile, da kommt achiv miyuchot als shliach zu gehen sein der mitzvah. So now it's as if you were appointed as a shliach. Once you're appointed as a shliach to fulfill it, so now you get the obligation to fulfill your shlichus, to fulfill the mitzvah. So before you began the mitzvah, you're just one individual out of the entire tzibur. Why do I have to do it, Dafke? But once you begin it, that itself is like you're appointed as a shliach. Once you were chosen and appointed as a shliach, now you have an obligation to see it through to the end. Now the Rebbe explains according to this something else that we learned in the previous parashiyos. Yeshleimar as al derech zeh given v'negei tzamiyim from negad b'nei Ruven. We'll understand over here, and on a deeper level, the whole story of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruven in connection to this whole concept of a maschel b'mitzvah oimim loy gemoir. When it came to their request, they requested of Moshe Rabbeinu, let us have as an inheritance over here this territory before we cross over the Yarden, and we're not interested in going into Eretz Yisrael. In the beginning, Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, your brothers are going to go fight in battle, entering into Eretz Yisrael, and you remain sitting here. Nor as sie haben geantwortet. And then, when they came and answered, we will go armed ahead of all the Yidden, hat Moshe das angenommen. Moshe Rabbeinu accepted this. So Moshe Rabbeinu accepted. Und dabei bewaret. But then Moshe Rabbeinu warns them, as vim loy tassen kein. If you will not do so, you sin to the Eibishter, you should know the great sin you'll have by not fulfilling the condition that you're going to go and fight with the Yidden and go ahead of all the Yidden to conquer Eretz Yisrael. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is warning them. So seemingly you can ask on this language that Moshe Rabbeinu uses here. And we understand, they accepted upon themselves this condition that they will go armed and fight with the Yidden. Why is Moshe Rabbeinu ever warning them with such severe terms? If you're not going to join Yidden, and not only join, but actually go ahead of all the Yidden, you sin to the Eibishter. Was von dem ist mashma, als viele Oibse wollen gehen in Milchama halten zusammen mit all Yidden gleich. That even if they're going to go and join the Yidden equally, aber nicht chalutzen gehen, man, but they're not going to go armed and not ahead of the Yidden, is es an inyan bilti rotzich chatossam. It's a sin that's going to happen over here. Why is it so severe, and why just this detail? If they're not going to go ahead of all the Yidden, is it mamash achet? Al pianal kann sagen, dass es verbunden mit dem Klal im Mischalte b'mitzvah gemoiraisa. So we can say that this, what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them, is also because of this rule that once you begin, you have to complete a mitzvah. Where did they begin anything? Where did Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruven begin conquering Eretz Yisrael? Kibush Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. To conquer Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. Was liegt auf all Yidden gleich is a chayvus hatzibur. This is that example of a mitzvah that's not an obligation of one person, but it lies upon Klal Yisrael to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Okay, the Rebbe actually incidentally brings there a very interesting machlokes regarding Kibush Eretz Yisrael, that it's actually a famous machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban, if it is a mitzvah or not. But the Rebbe says, Bizman Moshe l'chol hadayis. At that time period, the first time, everybody would agree that it was a mitzvah to conquer Eretz Yisrael. So now, b'shas mat manchel given Eretz Sichon v'oig zu b'nei Gad b'nei Ruven, when it was given as an inheritance, these lands that they were there, from Sichon and Oig to b'nei Gad and b'nei Ruven, is das durch dem geworden a teil von Eretz Yisrael. This became a part of Eretz Yisrael. Kommt b'meila ois, as durch zeir neuchel sein Eretz Sichon v'oig, once they received that as an inheritance, hat sich aufgetan lemafreya die aschalo von mitzvahs kibush Eretz Yisrael. So now what happens is, retroactively, when they conquered this land, they were conquering a piece of land of Eretz Yisrael. Then, at the time when they were conquering Eretz Sichon v'oig, it was not Eretz Yisrael, it's Eiver HaYarden. But once Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruven are receiving this an inheritance, it comes out that retroactively this was conquering a part of Eretz Yisrael. So they began the mitzvah here of conquering Eretz Yisrael. And so Derech Agav, the Rebbe explains another Rashi with what the Rebbe has said here. The mid vet euch verämpft is still in Pirish Rashi. This answers a contradiction that you have in another Rashi. Ein art, it's in one place in Parshas Pinchas, Zok Rashi says that Kivin shenichnas Moshe lenachlas b'nei Gad b'nei Ruven. Once Moshe Rabbeinu entered into this place of the inheritance of b'nei Gad b'nei Ruven, Samach, Moshe Rabbeinu was very happy. V'amar, and he said, it seems to me like the neder, the Eibishter made, that I will not enter into Eretz Yisrael, has been annulled. Das heißt, had gemeint, as hoteli nidri, that the reason why this vow was now annulled, nid gleich noch in Kibush Eretz Sichon v'oig. It wasn't right after the place was conquered. No, nachdem was hat manchel gewen. It was only after he gave it as an inheritance, Eretz Sichon v'oig, to b'nei Gad b'nei Ruven. Nachlas b'nei Gad b'nei Ruven. An inheritance. That's the point when Moshe Rabbeinu thought that the neder was annulled. On another art, but in another place in the beginning of Parshas Vaschanon, Zokte, what does Rashi say? That right after he conquered that territory, before it was given as an inheritance to Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruven, Moshe Rabbeinu said, I thought that my neder was annulled and I can enter into Eretz Yisrael. So at which time period did Moshe Rabbeinu think this? So the answer is, it's only after it became an inheritance for Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruven is das geworden a teil von Eretz Yisrael. So now it becomes a part of Eretz Yisrael. Ubemele is es lemafreya geworden die aschale from Kibush Eretz Yisrael. So retroactively, Moshe Rabbeinu realizes that really from the moment of when this territory was conquered, they were conquering a part of Eretz Yisrael, and from then the neder is possibly annulled. So therefore, both Rashis are discussing it from different perspectives. So now, as durch sie hat sich aufgetan die aschale von mitzvahs Kibush Eretz Yisrael. So since through Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruven began the mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael, so now takes effect upon them this specific obligation. In addition to the equal obligation that they have as part of the tzibur, along with all the Yidden, to endigen them kibush, to complete this conquering, if you began, so now it lies upon you an obligation to complete it. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them over here. So when they are requesting to receive this territory as an inheritance, so Moshe Rabbeinu answers them, as they sollen wissen that they must know, as durch dem bekommen sie a din von a maschel b'mitzvah. It's not only a piece of territory that they're getting, but they're beginning a mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael. Ubemele is nicht genug dem, das, was sie wollen helfen, die andere Schwatten in dem Hemshech Kibush Haaretz. It's not going to be enough for them to just come along and assist the other Yidden equally to conquer the Eretz Yisrael, Eiver HaYarden Marava, in the other side of the Yarden. No, now it lies upon them specifically an obligation to complete this mitzvah. As dav zayin chalutzim tarvru lifnei achechem bnei Yisrael. They have to go armed ahead of all the Yidden. Because now there's an obligation specifically upon them as beginners of this mitzvah to complete it. Beautiful. So you see over here why Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking to them about in such severe terms, chatosem, because this is an obligation now that lies specifically upon them. Von Jene Shal Teire and then Pirish Rashi. From the wine in Teire. The pnimius that we can take out of this Rashi. And also a lesson for our times. Heintige Dor is lit alle Simonim der Dor von Ikvise de Mashiach. The time that we live in, according to all signs that it says in Chazal, is the times right before the coming of Mashiach. Was wetten gichen a reis von Galus gehen in Arzena Akdaisha Bagula mitis durch Mashiach Tzedkenu. That very speedily, very soon, will come and take us to the Holy Land together with Mashiach. Is gesagt geworden euch auf dem einer mitzvah nekras el al shem hagoyimra. So regarding this time period that we live in, we can very much apply this expression of Chazal that the mitzvah is only attributed to the one that completes it. Which means as follows. Chotsch, as in die Friede Gedeiris, haben sich jeden geäußert gewähnt, beteire und mitzvahs in a größeren und hecheren Öfen wie in heintigen Dei. They did mitzvahs on a higher level, on a greater level than in our generation. They were greater people. Nevertheless, who do we attribute to this chus of completing it and bringing Mashiach to enter into Eretz Yisrael? It's our generation, the last ones. As die Geule kommt ins chus von den mitzvahs, was jeden seine Mekayim bedeira zeh. It comes in the merit of the Yidden doing mitzvahs in our generation. Durch Gemar v'siyam Aveda in Ikvise de Mashiach. Through those that do the completion of the Aveda right before Mashiach's coming. Was das darf geben und geht an Idud miyuchad. So this must give and gives a very strong encouragement. Jeden Yidden, for every Yid, to meisav sein in kiyam at Teire mitzvahs, to add and fulfilling Teire mitzvahs, and durch dem memai sein the Gula shal dem Mashiach tzedkenu. That the whole entire Aveda of all the generations, and when you do that one last mitzvah that completes it, it'll all be attributed to you, that you're the one that completed and brought Mashiach. Leidach is euch der Ra for jeden Yidden. On the other hand, we also have a lesson here for every single Yid specifically. Im Ischalta b'mitzvah gemay reisa. You began a mitzvah, see it through to the end. Says Yedua the Yigeres HaKodesh from Baal Shem Tov. It's well known the letter that the Baal Shem Tov wrote as of Zayn Shaila. Emes Haikosimar. When he asked Mashiach the question, when will the Master arrive? Hat Mashiach geantwortet, Mashiach answers, when your wellsprings of the Baal Shem Tov will be spread outward. Und es liegt achiv auf dem ganzen Klal Yisrael, if meifit sein, die Mayanis, Teires al Baal Shem Tov, Chutza zu alle Yidden. So in order to bring Mashiach, we know now what the way is, and this is a mitzvah that lies upon everybody equally, to spread the Teire of the Baal Shem Tov, to spread Chassidus to all Yidden. Specifically though, a special obligation applies to those Yidden that began this mitzvah. Was hat an ungeheben Ton and Afatzas HaMayanis that began with this inyan of spreading Chassidus. Se kann sein, it's possible, as noch a gewissen Zman, soll werden as raschlos in der Arbeit. A person should become weak in the work that he's doing. Trachtendig, thinking to himself, as me kann das überlassen von einer zweiten zum Mamshech sein. I began this project, I invested so much energy in this, I have to do everything till the very end. Let me leave the merit for someone else to do the rest. Und wird ihm helfen mit einer Eitze Teuve v'chayetze bezeh. And therefore he says, I'm not completely walking away from this. I'll be there in the background, I'll give my advice, and I'll guide him and so on, but let someone else take over. Is der Ra es chalta b'mitzvah gemay reisa. If you begin a mitzvah, you have to see it through to the end. Wie bald du hast angeheben die Arbeit von Afatzas HaMayanis. Since you began this work of spreading Chassidus, is auf dir a chiyuv und a schus zum Mamshech sein und goyme sein at die Aveda. So therefore it lies upon you the obligation and the merit to continue and complete this work. Aber frat noch, and specifically also, as me will haben, kol ribuy brachis und ashpos from the Eibishter. We want to have all the great brachis and all the other ashpos that come from the Eibishter. Was is mashpia mamshech al yedei avoda v'anasim b'chol dor v'dor, which comes through the rabbeim of every generation. Ubedereinu durch dem Rebbe dem Shver. And over here in our generation, it's through the Rebbe. So by continuing the work of the Rebbe, of Afatzas HaMayanis that you began, you're making yourself a keli for all those brachas. Und b'shas mis machlet mit ha-teikif und mit ha-nemes zum mamshech sein in dem Arbeit bei botzas ha-teire b'chlal. When one makes a strong and firm and real resolution to continue with spreading Teire in general, uba fatzas hamayanis chutza befrat, and specifically focusing on spreading Chassidus outward. helft der Eibishter und gibt Keiches, as me can beikommen alle Schwierigkeiten. The Eibishter will give you the power that you will be able to see it through. Going back to the whole point that we spoke about earlier in the Sikha, a situation where there's an einus, where a person feels like I can't continue. So many times the person starts something and then over years he comes to a point where he feels like he doesn't have the keiches to continue, and could be he might even be justified with such a kind of taina. But if you make a firm resolution that you want to take it to the very end, the Eibusher will give you the keich to complete it. And amongst all Yidden, zusammen, together, is men geimer the mitzvah, we complete the mitzvah. Me bringt darab Mashiach Tzidkenu. We bring down Mashiach Tzidkenu, lamata masaret tvachim, b'meheira v'yameinu mamish.